Well, I sometimes think that our biggest problem that we face, the biggest legacy issue, is that for over 100 years we've called these things mental health problems. And I slightly wonder, as I've explored your work and your colleagues' work, if this is a kind of misnomer. This is something we say because we don't have anything better to say because we didn't yet understand the problem. Because the more and more we talk about this, the more it becomes apparent that the things that we categorize as mental health problems, like anxiety or depression, I mean, take, for example, the guy running from the lion, are rooted in the physiology. They're rooted in the neurobiology, the anatomy. And if we had framed these things from the beginning as an imbalance in, if you like, the communication between different parts of the brain, I wonder if we would be so confused at this point, and I wonder if it would have been so difficult for pioneers such as yourself to bring this work forward.
I'm not critical about it because, humans are incredibly complex. And we can only talk about it as a neurological problem once we know a little bit about the neurology. What people don't realize is that 30 years ago, trauma was not on the map. When we created the diagnosis of PTSD in 1980, we said this is an extraordinary event outside the ordinary realm of human experience. That was our definition in 1980. And then we start looking at it and we go like, there's trauma everywhere. And what was astounding is we have been blind to domestic violence. We have been blind to incest. We have blind to child abuse. We just didn't see it. But here are people who are working with people who are upset, and nobody asked about, did anybody beat you up? Did anybody rape you? It did not exist. The textbooks of psychology and psychiatry had no talk about rape, incest, domestic violence. Like, we were so blind, and then, so this field is 40 years old. And then somebody finds out that doing cognitive behavioral treatment makes people 10% better, and they say, oh, we have found the treatment of choice and everybody should do CBT. No, that's the first little thing that appears to make a little bit of difference. We are very young and we don't know anything. And maybe a little bit of CBT might be helpful, but it doesn't solve the problem. And then we learn about neurobiology and people say, oh, it's an limbic system. Yeah, but then we learn, 10 years later, we learn something else. And we learn about how the vagus nerve works. And then people say, oh, the vagus nerve, everything, now we have the answer. No, because just above the vagus nerve, there's all kind of other brain structures that still make it more complicated. So we use the language that we have access to by the technology that happens to be available at that particular point, and we're usually about 10 years behind, so we're already using the technology for having used language that already is outdated by the time we formulate it.
Well, I mean, you have, thankfully for many of us, including myself, the pioneering work that you've done and your colleagues has led to there being pockets of professionals who do understand this formulation, and it has increased, and are attempting to provide treatments based on this deeper, more causal formulation of the problem. And you mentioned treatments that might work. What are you advocating at the moment? What would you recommend to people who are listening today who are resonating with your description of the problem? How should we be addressing this?
For me, the big window into the new world was EMDR. EMDR is a crazy treatment. You ask people to remember stuff, you don't have them talk about it, and then you ask them to move their fingers, eyes from side to side, and follow your fingers. Bizarre. And like everybody else, I said, don't do that, that's crazy stuff. And then, I got to see that it works. And we did the first study funded by NIH on how well EMDR works, and it works spectacularly well to deal with trauma. And I go like, wow, that's interesting. You do this weird thing, eye movements, that doesn't fit with any of the paradigms we have, and you bring about dramatic changes in people. So for me, this was like, oh, so bizarre things may work. And then people say, oh, I benefit from yoga from my trauma. And I go like, really? Putting your butt up in the air and twisting your body into a pretzel is helpful for dealing with old stuff. And, you know, being a little weird guy, I like to explore these weird things. Go to NIMH always 6 times because you always get rejected the first 5 times. So it's very labor intensive. And the last time we get a grant. And it shows us that yoga has a more profound effect on trauma than any drug that people have ever studied. So when you ask me, what do you think is the best treatment? I go, no, we're on a journey. We're on a journey of discovery, and let's see what works for you. And let's explore what works. And let's not say, I have found the answer. And then a very important thing that I also learned is that we usually talk about people as a unitary self. And then Dick Schwartz amplifies something that earlier people like Genet and Jung had, but it's become very popular now because things have always been said before. And he said, we have multiple parts. And in order to protect ourselves from feeling so horrible and helpless, we develop defense mechanisms. So we become very controlling and uptight, and that becomes our character structure in order to keep that terrified, frightened part of being under control. And then when I can't control it any longer, I feel completely out of control, and this person who's always uptight and careful suddenly starts drinking or taking cocaine. And we call that a firefighter. When the whole system breaks apart, there's something else jumps in to keep you under control. And you start understanding that people do what they can in order to survive, feeling completely disintegrated. And then you get to see that, oh, some people cut themselves in order to stay under control. And I go, that's interesting. For some people, cutting seems to be a helpful way of coping. The long range is probably not so great. Other people find that starving myself gives me more sense of control. And then people say to these people who starve themselves, you better eat. If you don't want to die, you have to eat. But they don't understand that this learning to not eat started off as a self-preservative way of surviving whatever they try to survive. And so that you get to see that a lot of weird things that people do are in essence self-protective ways of desperately trying to not succumb to complete helplessness. And so you get to see how complex people's adaptations are, and to help people, to respect people for whatever complex adaptation you have, and say, I wish you wouldn't kill people in order to survive, and let's try to do something about it. But this rage that you have, where does it come from?